Alright, well hello everyone. I know it's been a while, but today we're going to talk about Spartans, which I know are everyone's absolute favorite soldiers. Now, again, the context of this video is in tandem with the previous one about Vikings, because in the next video we're going to discuss about the famous debate that caused my wife and I a little bit of problem, Vikings versus Spartans and how that would plan out. So, what we're going to talk about today is Spartan training and military discipline and essentially what it created. So first off, in the creation of a Spartan soldier, one has to understand that every male citizen of Sparta was a soldier. Now, relatively speaking, Sparta's historical population was quite low, at least in terms of citizens. This is because the majority of the population that made up Sparta was actually composed of two different groups. The first was called perioikoi, the second, helots. What these were non-citizens who served craftsman role. Essentially think of them as not slaves, but second-class citizens who did all of the skilled artisanal work that was required in Sparta. The pottery makers, the masons, the smiths, etc. Anything that would be a job that was skilled and necessary to be done was done by a perioikoi. After all, no Spartan citizen was allowed to have one of these jobs. Instead, each man was a soldier, and that is it. The second one was a helot. Now, a helot was a slave, something along the lines of chattel slavery. These were citizens of other states that had been taken in war, made slaves, and they did all the drudgery work. Whether it was farming, whether it was back-breaking manual labor, anything along those lines. Even serving as training dummies on occasion for Spartan soldiers, which is a whole other thing that will need to be discussed. Now, Spartan citizenship, as we spoke about, was low. But each soldier within Sparta, each citizen, every male, was trained from a young age, starting at the age of 7 all the way through the age of 20, in rigorous military discipline and fitness, which was something that was almost unheard of across the Greek world. In Greek society, they had firmly believed that the only thing that was necessary for a boy to truly become fit was wrestling and dance. That was it. Also with a little bit of running on the side, but primarily what was needed for a soldier was wrestling for strength and dance in order to be both flexible and maneuverable, as well as endurance. This was something that the Spartans took in a completely different way. Starting from the age of 7, a young boy was taken from his mother and put in a group barracks with children of a similar age. This was called the agoge. Now, in the agoge, from the age of 7 all the way until the age of 20, when a boy was considered a man, this is where he received strict discipline and training. First off, these boys were given very little food. They were encouraged to steal, but they were also punished for stealing. In this way, the boys were taught to be cunning. At the same time, they were forced to, how should I put this? Be very brutal. So, for example, there was a type of training where a group of boys would be put onto an island, and their task was to shove other boys off of this island. In doing so, they would be punching, kicking, gouging out each other's eyes, etc., all in an effort to unseat someone. Those who did not succeed, those who were weak, were punished with whippings. Whippings were actually something that were a very common thing among Spartan society. If you were caught stealing food, you were whipped. If you were seen as weak, you were whipped. In fact, there were regular inspections, whether this was per week, per month, or every couple months, where the boys were lined up, and any that were deemed to look weak were whipped and beaten. This was something that was seen to instill strength in them, fortitude over time. What this did over the years is this created a person that was brutal, but cunning, and at the same time was someone that adhered to a strict sense of discipline and not necessarily camaraderie, but could work in complete cooperation with other men in order to accomplish set goals. By the time a Spartan soldier reached the age of 20, or boy reached the age of 20, he was then considered a soldier, and was first then drafted into the military and began participating in battle. At this point in time, we will now talk about the Spartan tactics as well as their armor and equipment. Now let's go ahead and talk about the Spartan equipment. A Spartan soldier was armed in the same way as any other Greek soldier was. Arguably though with slightly higher quality gear, as oftentimes this was not something that necessarily had to be provided by the individual soldier, but the state of Sparta would supply on occasion. This was something that included the hoplon, which is the large bronze shield, a cuirass that was either made solid of bronze or was something called linen thorax. Now what linen thorax was a hardened linen armor that was composed of multiple layers of cloth stuck together with glue. You could think of this as the point that was halfway in between a gambeson and a leather armor for a Viking, somewhere in between in terms of quality. This meant that it was significantly lighter than bronze and far more flexible, so easier to carry and function with over a long period of time, but it also wasn't as solid. So this would have given them a great degree of flexibility, even though their formation didn't necessarily allow it. On top of that, one would be equipped with the doru or dori, which was a spear. Now, the Spartan spear length on average ranged between 7 to 9 feet. This meant that it would be considered a long spear. Not quite a pike, but something that did have greater reach than on average the set arming spear that would have been used by most groups throughout medieval Europe. On top of that, they would be equipped with a bronze helmet, bronze greaves, and later on, if not bronze, there would be iron equivalents of this in different styles of armor depending on the age. Now the tactic that Spartans used when fighting was called the phalanx. This is the formation that you fought in as a Greek. This was not something that broke into individual combat like one would see in movies like 300 or things like that. What the phalanx did was you had rows of men, typically 8 feet deep, where a shield was slung across your arm, and the concave nature of the shield meant that it could partially rest on your shoulder. This way, even though the shield weighed 14 to 18 pounds, it was actually better supported than a shield that you would just hold out on your arm. Because if you had a flat shield holding out on your arm, even with a lighter, reduced weight, this meant that your arm was going to wear out significantly quicker. Each shield would overlap the shield of the man standing next to him. In this sense, it would create a nigh on impenetrable wall. Now, many people think that the hoplites would fight with their spear pointing like this, something that could be easily thrust underhanded. But that is not necessarily the case. You could thrust your spear underhanded, but the more common way of fighting was to actually hold your spear overhand and stab up and around. The reason for this, of course, is because when you have a hoplon formation, a phalanx formation that is holding their shield outward, you are far more likely to score a hit on a shield wall if you are thrusting your spear over and trying to reach. This is one of the key reasons why a helmet was so very important for Greeks. When you were thrusting, you wanted to aim in the gap that was either on the facial covering or from the neck down. Because that gap right into the shoulder is something that would kill and break a formation fairly easily. So we just discussed the Spartans' training earlier, and this is what made the Spartans such immense, deadly soldiers. One has to understand that the citizen soldiers of Sparta were soldiers first, not citizens. That being a soldier was how you became a citizen. As a result, even though the Spartan army historically was smaller, it was on average able to punch significantly above its weight. And what they had to do over time as armies became larger and more varied fighting techniques came down, whether this was from Macedonia, whether this was from evolutions that came from Athens or across the sea when Rome invaded, is that the Spartans were forced to adopt different styles of tactics that worked in tandem with the phalanx. These were not necessarily very good. because, after all, the way that their system was structured revolved around the phalanx. But they did have skirmishers that would work in tandem with them. Perioikoi and helots were drafted into the military to serve as skirmishers, whether this be as slingers, whether this was as javelin men, etc. They would work around the flanks of the Spartan phalanx and would harass the enemy. The second thing is cavalry. Cavalry was not something that the Spartans utilized really until around 484 BC. And this is when they realized that they would need to actually adopt some. But the interesting thing is that historically, cavalry was something that was used by elites. You had the richest, wealthiest, most powerful men who served as an elite cavalry force. But for the Spartans, this was only partly true. In order to be a cavalryman, you had to be able to support your own horse. You had to be wealthy to afford your armor. But at the same time, cavalry was seen as weak to the Spartans. A true man fought in the phalanx with his fellow citizens. So what this ended up meaning is that the soldiers who would fight as citizen cavalry were the richer, wealthier, but weaker men. Perhaps those who were already starting to falter with age, or those who, while they were wealthy enough, they simultaneously were not strong enough to stand in the phalanx formation. That's unfortunately how it worked out for them. This, of course, leads us to the final question of what would happen from the previous video if a Spartan army went up against a Viking army. This will be discussed in our next video here. I thank you for watching. The next one should go up here within the next couple days. Besides that, if there are any questions, anything that you would like to ask, if there are any more in-depth videos, anything that you want to discuss, feel free to reach out to me here in the comments. Shoot me a message on Instagram, maybe something on TikTok. I would be more than happy to discuss. You all have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.